Welcome back, film fans. Thought I'd jump on and do a video to what will be somewhat of a somber video, but nonetheless hopefully a celebratory one. Celebrating the kind of life and career of the late James Earl Jones, the actor who of course passed away yesterday, that being September the 10th, Tuesday, September the 10th, 2024, at the grand old age of 93. So he had long innings, bless him. He had a long, fruitful and obviously very productive life. And of course, he's most well known to us film fans, cinephiles, I suppose, for kind of, wow, of course, there's the main thing is Star Wars, right? The Star Wars franchise, he's most famous for voicing, not obviously doing the physical performance, but voicing, of course, Darth Vader in the Star Wars franchise. They didn't go with the original voice of the actor playing the role. Thank God they made the right choice with James Earl Jones. And maybe for a more modern generation, also known for providing the voice for Mufasa in Lion King. Both the original and the remake in, I think that was circa 2019, which Jon Favreau directed, I think. I haven't seen that, but of course I grew up with the original Lion King from 1994, the animated version, which, like I said, he provided the voice for Mufasa, Simba's father, in a kind of role that traumatized a whole new generation of kids. It was the kind of new Bambi for us all. Those are probably his two most iconic roles, really, in all of cinema. Of course, he was, he's famous for what parts he does have in, say, 80s films like Coming to America and Field of Dreams. But he didn't play kind of lead or substantial roles in those movies. And so therefore he has a great place, I think, in a lot of the childhood hearts of a lot of us. And of course he had that kind of iconic voice. He was, as some people have been saying, Morgan Freeman before Morgan Freeman, in the sense of Morgan Freeman's obviously another African-American actor who's very much vaunted and celebrated for his iconic voice, as was James Earl Jones. However, I wanted to kind of jump on here and talk about two roles in particular, specifically, which are kind of far less celebrated or well known and renowned, but for me that demonstrate why James Earl Jones was a fantastic lead actor. Because this is the thing, right, is that James Earl Jones, I think it's kind of almost like a backhanded compliment or a little bit of a disservice to say, just remember him for his voice when he was actually a great on-screen presence. I think going by his career, maybe his first love was more the kind of the theatre, in terms of as far as acting's concerned. But, in terms of film, I think he was seldom probably given the opportunities he was due, I suspect, being an African-American potential lead actor. Because when you look through his career, the lead roles are sparse. However, there are a couple, and I do want to highlight them. You have to remember the historical context here with someone like James Earl Jones. He's kind of like, he's just followed the likes of like Sidney Poitier, and there's only a few African-American actors before him that carry that kind of gravitas, like Sidney Poitier being one, but also the likes of Harry Belafonte or Paul Robeson really being the kind of key ones that you can think of. And he made his acting debut in 1962, believe it or not, in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, in a kind of bit part there. But it wasn't really until he won a Tony for his on-screen performance as James Jefferson in The Great White Hope, the stage production of that, and then reprised the role for the cinematic adaptation in 1970, for which he got a Best Actor nomination. He didn't win. George C. Scott won for Patton, I believe, that same year. But nonetheless, he got nominated, and it was, for him, a kind of at last and for once, a lead, kind of meaty, juicy role for him as an actor. And like I say, he played the role of the boxer James Jefferson, which essentially is the, not there's no great attempts to kind of mask who that's based off of, which is of course the real life boxer Jack Johnson, who was boxing's first world, not coloured, but world heavyweight champion. And there's a big distinction to make there, which is that essentially Jack Johnson was the first boxer to break the colour bar that was in boxing, what's known as the colour bar, which essentially means back then, because of the racism that was endemic to the sport and America back then, you had black fighters fight black fighters, white fighters fight white fighters. You couldn't have them fight each other. And so Jack Johnson, when he became the first world heavyweight champion, not coloured heavyweight champion, because there were two distinct championships, he broke a lot of barriers, to say the least, but he also pissed off a lot of people and angered a lot of the white population and the white establishment, for sure. To the point where they actually introduced a law, I think it was in 1925, where they made it illegal for footage to be transported across state lines because they had that much fear of a contagion spreading in terms of a figure of black excellence and esteem and empowerment in Jack Johnson. And so the establishment came up with differing ways to try and get rid of the bout off Jack Johnson, one being introducing what were called Great White Hopes, hence the title of the play in the movie, to essentially a white boxer to go in and beat Jack Johnson. The problem is that Jack Johnson kept winning, and he kept winning emphatically. And he also kept winning, when I say emphatically, with style, in a way that taunted the racist white audiences in the establishment at the time, because he would win in style and he would have fun doing it. And so as a result, he was actually a figure that became not only prominent and infamous, very controversial, but made a lot of money. Remember, this is at the time when racial segregation was still a thing, racism was still a thing, to the point of, lynchings in America were common, unlawful killings of black people were common, and this was a guy who was essentially throwing that all back at the establishment. So he's putting his life on the line every time he kind of essentially, well, from the moment he became a real public figure, Jack Johnson, and he did it with such audaciousness, to be honest with you. If actually any of you are interested in reading up more about Jack Johnson, because he lived kind of obviously a terrific and very interesting life, there's actually a biography called Unforgivable Blackness, which I haven't actually read yet. It's on my to-read list, but apparently it's meant to be magnificent. And I think there was a series adapted from the same name by Ken Burns, the famous documentarian, called Unforgivable Blackness, which I think is a multi-part series, if any of you are interested in that. But so essentially The Great White Hope, the film, is a thinly veiled biopic of Jack Johnson's life, but of course it's Jack Jefferson in the film. And the takeaway image from that film, for it being, of course, a magnificent performance by James Earl Jones, who gets obviously a lot of screen time being the main actor in the role, is that scornful smile that's in a lot of close-ups of James Earl Jones, that takes this kind of this hurtful but also enjoyment out of taunting the establishment in terms of his ability to essentially be in this position of relative power. Now, the film at the time, as well as the play, it received mostly positive reviews, but also received some negative ones. The film didn't even make its money back, by the way, which is probably quite a shock for an Oscar-nominated, at least, performance. It didn't even make back its $9 million budget at the time. And like I say, there were some kind of less positive reviews, which kind of saw it as kind of token kind of Hollywood liberalism, I suppose, or an attempt at kind of playing a race relations story, although the writer of the play said at the time that this is not about black versus white, this play. Racism is indeed part ingrained into the story, but it's actually about the tragic story of one man and his victim of circumstance and the external forces of the world pressing upon him. And that really comes across well in the film. The film itself I really don't recommend that much, actually, because I think as a result of being an adaptation of a play, it comes across kind of overly stagey and uncinematic as a result. But I do recommend it for James Earl Jones's performance. So I'm saying you should watch off the basis of his performance, which I think is magnificent. And that's one of the two films that I want to recommend, and it makes a very good double bill with the second film, which I will mention shortly in due course. I just want to talk a little bit more about The Great White Hope for a second, because I think the film does do very, very well in revealing a lot of nuances in character. Like I say, the close-ups of the images that I remember of his kind of, like I say, that scornful smile that he possesses, which seems very reminiscent of, actually, if you see some photos of Jack Johnson, you see like he's smiling in the ring, giving punishment to these fighters that have been brought in to beat him as a kind of the next great white hope. But the thing to take away from the film, I think, is the fact that Jack Jefferson in the film, as well as Jack Johnson in real life, it was a kind of tragic figure by victim of circumstance, in the sense that it's that old adage that you can't please everyone all the time. And that he received scorn, obviously, not just off racist white people, but also people in the African American community who expected and wanted, or had their impressions upon him and their demands upon him of what he should be as a figure to them. There's a great scene early on in the film in which, after the weigh-in for the fight, which he, against, the first great white hope, they line up against him, who was played, I think, by Ali's sparring partner at the time. Incidentally, actually, Ali saw the play. I think it wasn't the film, but he saw the play, and he said, this film, if you take out the racial, the interracial relationships part, because that is a huge part of the film as well as the play, and of course Ali was a segregationist at the time, he believed in separate racial coupling, essentially. He said this might as well be about me, because of course Muhammad Ali at the time was facing his own form of God, what's the word I'm thinking of? Essentially his own form of punishment for being a kind of conscientious objector in the Vietnam War. So he was being pressed upon to, and was actually indeed forced to vacate his title. So he was being oppressed in his own sense. And of course the film is about, because the first scene we're introduced to with Jack Jefferson, is where he's in the gym and the white woman is watching in the background, and he kind of goes over to her and kind of starts laughing with her and adorning her and kissing her. And then his manager comes and says, look, they're pissed at you for fighting white people. They're pissed at you for beating white people. They're pissed at you for being heavyweight champion. But you dating a white woman is like the thing you cannot do. That's the thing that will get you in trouble. And of course, that's what they try and use to pin him down, as it were, and punish him for being, putting him back in his place, as it were, as a black male, for interracial coupling, essentially, and carrying women across state lines, which is what Jack Johnson was punished for. Incidentally, he was only pardoned for that only in 2018, so posthumously pardoned, Jack Johnson. So that's a staggering fact right there in of itself. But going back to the film, it's this idea that he's a tragic figure because he cannot, like I said, it's this great scene where after the weigh-in, going back to that point, a group of black people come up to him and say, oh, we're praying for you. He says, praying for me, why? To beat this guy, and because you're as a black man. And he scorns them and says, so you're not praying for me to kind of, return home safely. The fact that there's loads of people out there that want to kill me and probably are going to try and kill me. The fact that I put my life on the line every time I step out in public. You just want to do it for your own benefit. So there's this idea of the pressures of him being an individual, and then the pressures of the collective of being a black representative of being a black man, and the contradictions there of his individualistic pursuit. We see of essentially excelling in the sport of boxing. We see a scene later on in the film, actually shortly afterwards, his kind of where he's celebrating his victory over the fallen opponent, in which he's actually scorned himself by a fellow black man who says, you're just making money for white men. You're just a puppet of the white establishment. And so he's in this position where, of course, he really can't please any member of any one group. And as a result for that, he's a kind of doomed protagonist living a tragic life, really. And I think that's the takeaway of the film, that James Earl Jones plays that position of hurt and relative empowerment, but vulnerability at the same, not really vulnerability, but the fact that that he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. He's in this position where he cannot win, as it were, as a sports person, as a sporting individual. The second film I wanted to talk about was that I think makes a great 1-2 billing with this is The Man, which is a TV movie from 1972, and it was an adapted from a book, I think of the same name. It's a lengthy book, of course, which I haven't read because I was only made aware of this film very recently, and I watched it today, as a matter of fact, in which he plays on screen the President of the United States. He was the first man, James Earl Jones, to play a black president. Remember, this is 30 years before David Palmer, Dennis Haysbert, who played David Palmer in the series 24, did, and even that was considered kind of breaking barriers at the time. So he played a president 30 years before that, and it's about the story in which essentially the president at the time dies. A ceiling falls on him when he's attending somewhere in a foreign country. It's kind of explained secondhand, and the vice president doesn't want to take up the role because he feels he's too ill and can't live up to the duty, but you sense that he's actually reluctant to take the role, even if he was healthy anyway. And so the buck keeps getting passed on until it reaches his character, and James Earl Jones takes up the role. And as a result of circumstance, a victim of circumstance, you could argue, becomes the first black president, but also the first undemocratically elected president, which actually, so this film predates not only Obama's election by roughly 36 years, but also predates, who was the first unelected president of the United States? Was it Glenn Ford in the 70s? So I think it predates that as well by a couple of years. I think it was Glenn Ford. And so it's really kind of prescient from that standpoint. In fact, you can watch this film for free on YouTube. It's on YouTube. Just put in The Man 1972 James Earl Jones. A couple of copies come up. It's not in great quality, and it is a TV movie, so the production values aren't great necessarily. But again, watch it for James Earl Jones's performance, which I think is magnificent in this film. And some of the YouTube comments are quite nice to read, actually, because you actually have, essentially people commenting who are black saying, we watched this back in the 70s as like a science fiction film. It might as well have been a science fiction film because it was inconceivable to us that we'd have a black president. So that's quite powerful to read. And to know that James Earl Jones played that role, and he played it so well in this film, in this TV film, is pretty fantastic, to be fair. There's a great scene early on in which he's kind of, I don't think he's been sworn in yet, but he's been told he's president. And he goes back home, and his daughter's picked up by Secret Services and brought to him. And she's actually typically anti-establishment. And he kind of says to her, look, you're going to have to stop going on these protest marches now because your father's now president, kind of type thing. You have to rein that in. And it's a real kind of, it's well written, but it's also beautifully acted because, he's drinking whiskey from his glass and his hand is shaking. And you just get a real, not a movie, quote unquote, esque portrayal of a president who's kind of seems infallible and is this kind of symbolic representation of what a president's meant to be. They're meant to be this embodiment of perfection. But you're actually this kind of very human, flawed guy who is a victim of circumstance, who nonetheless takes on the role and tries to do it to the best of his abilities. When throughout the film you have circumstances conspiring against him, say in South Africa in the film, and you also have his own cabinet members that are conspiring against him because they don't want a black president in charge. And he just plays it so well, and his screen presence is really commanding. And you kind of go, that's the president we all need. But by virtue of him being actually very flawed and very human, ironically. And I think it makes a great 1-2 with The Great White Hope, because in The Great White Hope you have someone who achieves relative success in their field, in boxing, and shows that they're unbeatable in a sense. They are like essentially the best boxer on the planet, being heavyweight world champion. However, they're also utterly a victim of circumstance. Like the external world is pressing upon them, right? And there's nothing they can really do to get around that, as it were. Whereas here, he's the most powerful man on the planet, kind of symbolically, United States president, but he's actually a man who's happened into that by accident and is very human and fallible. And so they're kind of like two sides of the same character in a way, but he plays them very differently. And so I think that shows his incredible range, but also, like I say, it makes a great double bill in terms of you're getting two sides of the same coin. in terms of types of characters that he's playing. So yeah, I just wanted to jump on and say, recommend those two films, those two performances in particular. Check them out. Like I say, I think they're both available on YouTube actually. The Great White Hope is. Like I said, the copies aren't great. And I just wanted to recommend them by virtue of paying tribute to the great actor that was James Earl Jones, and saying he was more than just a voice, but he was actually a great screen presence and a great actor as well. And it's a shame that he didn't, off the back of those two performances, particularly one which he was Oscar nominated for, that he didn't get more roles, substantial lead roles or meaty and weighty roles behind him. And we could suspect as to why that's the case. Maybe it is that his first love was the theatre, but one could also argue maybe it's because he was an African-American actor still at the wrong time. And he himself was a victim, so in which case art imitates life and vice versa for him, which is very sad, but nonetheless we should we should also reconcile that with the fact that he was in the end a tremendous star that a lot of people loved dearly. So rest in peace to James Earl Jones. If you'd like to, of course, share your memories of or your favourite performances and talk about the two films in particular that I've raised, by all means leave comments in the video. If you've liked my tribute to him, of course, you can like, share and subscribe the video if you subscribe to the channel if you wish. And yeah, with that, like I say, rest in peace. We lost one of the great iconic actors. And yeah, as always, I'll see you on the next one, and take care, guys.